screen. Today we're going to be talking about specification review of an infrastructure project. I'm Dwayne Klein. I'm the manager of automation technology here at Turtle & Hughes, and I spend quite a lot of my time working in the infrastructure side of the business, and that means I spend a lot of time looking at specifications and plans. And what I thought I wanted to do today was kind of go through the process of looking at a project, trying to figure out what information we should be looking for. And so some of the things that we're going to cover in today's agenda is, first of all, where do I find a project? What do I need? And what products should I be looking for? And since we're talking about controls, these are the things we're typically going to be looking for: PLCs, OITs, network software, things like that. When you start going into a specification, of course, there's going to be a lot of other information in there. So the first question is, where do I find projects? Something that folks are, wondering, where do I start? Well, word of mouth. I know a lot of folks in our switchgear department, they know a guy, they know someone, they're always interacting with, whether it's contractors or engineers. They are aware of the projects that are going on. What other ways are there? Well, there's other services that you can subscribe to, such as BidNet Direct or Insight or Dodge. And there's some others out there as well that services, either, let's say, for New York State, they've got a process, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, they've got a process in which you can go in there and look for different types of projects. These are all different ways that you can get access to these types of projects. Here at Turtle & Hughes, at least in the automation department, I tend to use Dodge. The Dodge process is a subscription, and it actually goes back quite a long ways. It used to be where Dodge kind of collected the paper documentation, the paper plans and specifications, and then you could participate in that way. Otherwise, you are left with having to go to the various municipalities and actually buying them directly from those municipalities, those plans and specs. But some of these services make it a little bit easier. So if you subscribe to it, you can do it based on a region or a state. At Turtle & Hughes, for the automation department, I subscribe to Dodge for New York and New Jersey. So any of those projects, public bid projects that are being listed through Dodge, I have access to. And this is actually a screenshot of their older screen. They've kind of got two screen sets going on here, but it's a way of looking for the different types of projects, and you can set up various search engines in these services to look for either keywords or maybe manufacturers or certain engineering firms, end users, so you can kind of keep track of what projects are they working on. Okay, so maybe you've used one of those services, or you've gotten a set of plans and you're like, I found a project. What should I be looking for? And to me, some of the main points that you want to be looking for in these projects are, well, first of all, who's bidding? If you're a systems integrator, you need to know which contractors maybe are bidding the project, who's going to be asking for pricing, who's going to be asking you, hey, I need you to, can you give me a submittal on what you would supply for this? So you would also want to know who's the A&E firm. Maybe you know someone at the A&E firm, or maybe you know how they tend to operate, what they typically put in their plans and specs. Who's the owner? Who's actually the people who are going to be buying ultimately the system? Is it a municipal utility authority? Is it some utility company? Who's the actual owner? There's also the other things, special conditions. So as an example of special conditions, you might have something that specifies an MWBE, or minority or woman-owned business. For example, Turtle is a WBENC listed business, which means that there is different criteria used if you're a woman-owned business, minority-owned business, or if you're a service disabled veteran type of business. There's different clauses in those types of contracts that may be of value to you. What else? Well, getting down to the nitty-gritty, you're looking for the plans, you're looking for the specifications, and you're looking for the very important addendums, the things that come out in addition to the plans and specs when they're originally released. So let's start by talking about the specifications. In a project listing, depending upon the size and scope of the project, these plans and specs are going to include everything. A very large project might include the requirements for the landscaping, the plants and shrubs that are going to be planted, the type of fire extinguishers they want, the lighting, the sensors. In addition, of course, the instrumentation, the controls, the power equipment, switchgear, right? So there's going to be a lot of stuff in these plans and specifications that may be of use for your for what you hope to submit. And while it would be ideal, as I say there, for all these specs to have the information placed in the same consistent location, unfortunately, that's not always the case. So as an example, specifications for VFDs and motor control centers are usually in the 1600 or 2600 location. But when it comes to specs for the PLCs, operator interface terminals, HMI, and some of the network or software, I have found it on all these different sections. So they're not always placed in the exact same location. So again, you have to take a look, do some searching. Like I said, most of these services provide a type of search engine to help you find and narrow down where you're looking for. I sometimes will download different sections regardless of where I think the PLC is, because there's maybe ancillary information that I need to capture that may be in some of these other sections. So I may, as a routine, go ahead and grab 1600, 26, 40, 46. I may grab a couple of different ones, and then I can kind of review those PDF documents on my own. And what about the subsections? So once you get into a particular section, so in this case, this was the 11,000 section of a particular project. That's where I happen to have found the PLC portion. In those sections, it's going to be further subdivided into subsections. Okay, so in this case, if you're looking there, you can see that it's 11.226. This happens to be where they have programmable logics controllers. So they'll break these sections into subsections, further defining whether it's going to be a network portion or a PLC portion or a software portion. So again, you might want to not grab just a portion. You might want to grab the entire section. And I've had that over the years where someone says, hey, could you help me out with this? And they'll send me just a paragraph from a subsection. And I'm like, I need the big picture. I need to see the whole thing in order to make really heads or tails out of what they're doing. One of the things you may notice if you can read this particular screen is something else, that when you're looking at some of the sections, you're going to be kind of taking notice that just because a project is new, it doesn't mean that all the contents in that section or that specification are also new or up to date. In this case, if you look there in that paragraph, you can see that the specification, this is a fairly new job, is actually calling for the use of a Rockwell 9300 RADES, which is a telephone modem kit. Okay, Rockwell stopped making those in March of 2021, and most people stopped installing, analog modems into their control systems many years ago. So even though you may have a brand new project, a brand new specification, you're not necessarily going to be getting the most up-to-date information. And that can be a little bit of a dilemma, because you're trying to supply what the specification is calling for, but the specification may be calling for something that's obsolete or has been retired or is about to be retired, which is something else that you're going to have to keep in mind when you're going through your submittals. Well, we've looked at some specifications. What would be next? The next would be plans. What plan section should I be looking for? Typically, again, in this Dodge section, it's broken up by different segments. There's the electrical portion, there's the mechanical portion, and in this case, there's also an other or special section of the Dodge listing of the plans. Again, typically for the controls piece, I'm going to be looking at the electrical and then the other and special. Most of the time, I'm not going to find what I need in plumbing or civil, or the architectural. I mean, if you want to get a sense of what the building looks like or the layout, that may be one thing. But to get into the hardcore portions of this, the plans that are applying to the controls piece, those are the two areas that I typically want to take a look at: the electrical section and then the other section. And then once you get into those sections, you're going to be looking for certain types of things. In this case, as you can see there, I've got a listing under other for the P&ID, the drawings. There's a control panel details and wiring. There's a PLC wiring diagram, a typical wiring diagram. So I'm typically going to be looking for something to do with the control network, some sort of maybe a block diagram for that. How's the panel laid out? In some cases, the drawings will have a very detailed drawing of what the control panel is supposed to look like, including a complete bill of material. And other times it's a black box. And the contents of that black box may or may not be noted in the drawings, but hopefully they'll either the drawings or the specification. And if they're not in either, then they could be in the addendums. So what am I going to look for in the addendums? This is a screenshot of another project. And as you can see, the addendums come out at different times. A project may be released at a certain date, but then after the specs have been released, the plans have been released, there's a period of time in which folks can ask questions. That typically is identified up front, where you can, submit questions asking about, hey, I'm not seeing this, or could you please clarify the following? And when they go through that process, they will then publish addendums that go into more of those details. So as you can see here, there were some addendums that were added in May, some were added in June, some were added in July, and some were added in August. So it's an ongoing process. So when you're working on a particular project, you need to be aware that periodically there may be additional addendums. And if you're on a list, you'll be notified of those. And if you're not, then it's just something that you're going to need to kind of keep track of. Make sure that you're aware that there are changes through the addendums. And this is also where they would typically announce bid date changes. You're getting yourself all ready for a bid that's going to be, coming out on February 1st, and something changes in which you suddenly have to, there were some addendums, and now the bid date's been moved out to the 14th or the 28th. The bid date can change. So you need to be aware of the addendums. All right, so let's dig into it a little bit deeper here. Let's take a look at this controls page. Like I said, each portion of a spec is typically divided up into those sections, and typically within that subsection, there's going to be three main areas. The first is your general section. This is going to be defining your scope of work, the related work, the standards used, the definitions of terms. It's going to kind of give you the overall picture of what's going to be required in this case for the PLC hardware and software. All right. The second section is going to be your products section. That's where it's going to get into a lot more detail of what is supposed to be actually supplied. In this case, we're looking at PLCs. So now part 2 is going to get into chassis-based programmable logic control system. All right. I always like when I do my searches, you can kind of see down there at the bottom of the page that I've kind of highlighted the word logics. And that's how I do my searches when I'm trying to figure out which projects are going to include things that I might be interested in getting involved in. So I'll look for terms like logics, factory talk, PLC. You can put in any manufacturer's name. You can put in different products in there that may help narrow down the search for this thing. And again, so in part 2 of a specification, this is where you're going to get into a lot more detail as far as what they are looking for. What kind of PLC? What kind of an I/O module do they want? They'll typically define those I/O modules. If it's going to be AC inputs, DC inputs, what are the parameters around those modules that they are requiring? That type of detail is usually going to be found in part 2 of the subsection that you're looking at. All right. And there is a part 3. Part 3 is usually the executable part, which is of greater interest to the systems integrators, as far as, okay, I know what your goal is. I know what the parts are. What do you want me to do with it? And that's what part 3 is going to get into. One of the key areas when I'm trying to go through a specification is the I/O. I need to know certain things when I'm working on a project, and the I/O is a key part of that. So I need to know things like what type of I/O, what's the quantity of that I/O, and what's the distribution? Where is it found? I can't tell you how many times over the years where someone will say, hey, here's the I/O I need for this project. Can you help me lay something out? And it will say 24 discrete inputs, 12 outputs, 4 analog in and 4 analog out. And I'm like, well, is the analog in 4 to 20 or 0 to 10 volt? Is the discrete inputs, is it AC? Is it DC? What about the outputs? AC, DC, or relay? We need those kinds of details. And where would you find that kind of detail? Well, typically one of 2 places. You might find an appendix in the specification that gets into the actual details of the I/O. Maybe they're breaking it down by the type of I/O and the location. This is great because if you've got that kind of information, you know what's going to be in your main control panel as well as what's going to be in your remote panels. And that's also going to give you some idea as to how these things are going to be interconnected, using Ethernet typically these days, as opposed to some of the older proprietary networks. Okay. You may not have such a table either in the specification or in the appendix to the specification. It may be in the drawings. And that's what's shown there on the right. So you may have to go into the actual drawings and they will break it out by showing what's going into the PLC and what points are going to be displayed in the HMI. One of the things I tell you that you need to be aware of when you're looking at those drawings is they may show a block of I/O, and then in fine print above it, it'll say something like typical for 4. So if you are trying to go through the drawings to add up the I/O, just be aware that they may have either on the drawing or in the notes on the drawing page how many of those type you should be counting. One of the things you need to be aware of is that the drawings and sometimes the tables that they may supply don't always agree. So if you have the time, it's probably a good idea to go through and do it both ways to make sure that you have a pretty good count as far as the type of I/O in total that you need. One of the things else when you're looking at the I/O tabulation is somewhere in the specification, again, usually in the part 2, is they'll tell you how much spare I/O they want. It'll come out and actually say that you should have pre-wired 20% spare, and they may also ask for a certain spare slot arrangement. They want so many additional slots available, let's say in a more modular chassis, that they want for future possible expansion. So when you're doing your tabulations of the I/O, don't forget to include the spares. Once I know where my spare is, what am I going to do with the information? Well, one of the things that I like to do is I create a spreadsheet. I have a standard spreadsheet that I use that's going to have an I/O type of a grid. And I can kind of break this down by things like I reference what section in the spec I found it, what page it was, and then maybe what the drawing was that I found it on that as a reference. And then I break it out by, is it 24 volt DC in or AC out, AC in, DC out, DC in, and so on. And this way I can kind of keep a running tally as far as what's going to be necessary for a particular main control panel as well as the remote panels. You can kind of work this out any way you want. And again, when I'm doing this, I can also then keep the tabulation as far as my spare slots and spare I/O. One of the other things, of course, you're going to want to look for is the network. These days, we can't do anything without looking at the network. And these days, almost everything is going to be on Ethernet of some form. Make sure to review the specification. Look for those drawings that are going to show you what the network layout's supposed to be. And then in the product section of the specification, look for what they are looking for with regards to that network. So here you can see the background, a bit of a drawing. This was an actual project that we worked on last year, the year before, an extremely extensive network. Multiple VLANs were required, virtual local area networks. And in the specification, they were very particular about what they were looking for. In this case, I had done a search for the word Stratix, and there in the specification, they actually called out an Allen Bradley Stratix 5700. This is kind of a nice spec because it says no like, equivalent, or equal item permitted. You don't run into that too often on public bid specs, but because of an installed base, they wanted to keep everything the same, so they actually put that in the specification. Just something else to keep in mind is that since the Rockwell switches are made in conjunction with Cisco, specifications that may call out Cisco switches typically are going to accept a Stratix switch because a Stratix switch is a Cisco switch that was built in conjunction with Rockwell. It's been Rockwellized. A Stratix switch has been designed to better interact more directly with a Rockwell control system. But something else to keep in mind as you're working on that, when you're looking through your specification at that portion. Next, we've looked at the PLC, we've looked at the network. I'm also going to be looking at the SCADA system, the HMI system, okay? You will frequently see the OIT referred to a panel view type product, while an HMI is going to be referring to a PC server or client server based type product, all right? Frequently, the development software is required as well as the actual project software. So they may ask for, as you can see here in this particular specification, they say they want 2 copies or 1 copy rather of FactoryTalk View Studio, which is the development software. And then they want 2 SE servers and 8 clients. Again, this was a very nice specification. They were very specific as far as what they wanted. Sometimes the spec will only reference the software they want to see used, but as far as how many clients, how many servers, and so on, that may be tucked away in the drawing someplace. So again, we're going to be looking in this specification for who the acceptable products, and hopefully it says something like Rockwell Automation FactoryTalk products. Makes our job a lot easier. All right. So project review and the next step. Now that you've collected information on what the project requires from a hardware, software, and network perspective, what's the next step? Next step would be to start laying out the system. And it would be helpful if you had a tool to do just that. And such a tool does exist from Rockwell. It is called Integrated Architecture Builder, or IAB. And we're going to cover that in the next section, which will be starting at noon. So I figured at this point, any questions on this rather brief review of what how we would look for the basics in a particular infrastructure project? Any questions?
Dwayne, my only question is, nothing came up on the screen for me. I can see you, but I don't see the presentation. Will you be sending that out? Your PowerPoint?
Absolutely. Once we're all done here today, I will be sending out a PDF version of this presentation as well as the next one, and I'll get that out to you. If you want to just drop me a note, I will be happy to put that together and send it out to you. As far as the recording, yeah, the plan is that we will typically, what we do at Turtle is we publish this up on our YouTube channel. So once we're all wrapped up here, I will get that up on the YouTube channel and send you a notification that that is available for anyone to take a look at who may not have been able to make today's meeting. Any other comments or questions? All right, well, if there's nothing else, like I said, we're going to be taking a bit of a break. We'll be reconvening at noon today to take on part 2, which is going to be how to go about using Integrated Architecture Builder. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dane. See you.